All right, Zach, welcome beyond. Glad to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I was reading your profile. You are a man of mystery in the sense of international travel. James Bond has nothing on you.
Well, James Bond drinks martinis and I like Manhattans.
Well, there you go.
There we go. Right.
So just for the audience's benefit, we're joined today, of course, by Zack Selch, a global force and leader in helping multinationals and startups develop and execute on their international strategy to grow and access sales to these key markets. So Zack, if you could take the audience back and where it all started from you, you're obviously this incredible international person, but where'd you get your start?
So, if you'll pardon me for taking that very literally, I like to say that when I was a little boy, I I really liked the cartoons that involved travel. And you had, I don't know if you remember Johnny Quest, which was a little boy who traveled around the world. And I just, as a little boy, I thought, this is what I want to do. And as a teenager, I got involved in selling at a flea market. And I realized that I could sell and people needed people to travel around and sell. And, you know, it would be just as easy to be a beer salesman in rural Pennsylvania or to sell something in Africa. And I decided that I was going to do everything I could to start selling internationally. So that was actually something I decided on as pretty much, you could say, a little boy. I went through the Army, and when I got out of the Army, I was able to leverage that into a job selling surplus military medical equipment. And I started selling in Africa, and then the wall came down and I started selling in Eastern Europe. And by the time I was 25, I had a pretty good record of experience selling to various cultures. And that's a big part of it. You know, not that many people are comfortable negotiating with different cultures and selling in different ways and so on. And then I went from, you know, selling pretty much junk to getting jobs with real serious manufacturers because I had this background of experience. And I've been doing that for 30 years, 32 years. And that's basically my what do they call it in the comic books? My story, my background story, right?
Yeah. Well, you are a global traveler for sure. But, you know, as I look at some of the posts that you have in your LinkedIn profile, you have videos from all over the world sharing your insights into connected business, certainly internationally. But as we think about this COVID era that we're in, this incredible pandemic, will COVID-19 affect or change the way international business is conducted?
Yeah, I think in two ways. I would say most of my life I've thought you really have to have face-to-face interaction. And I think what's going to happen after COVID is 80% of that will go away because people will be more comfortable with Zoom. They'll be more comfortable with technology. They'll be more comfortable doing business with people that they haven't actually sat down and eaten with. And so we're going to have a lot of that, I think. That's going to be part of it. Now, I'll tell you another thing which I really believe is going to happen. The United States, for the past 75 years, has enjoyed a position of everybody saying, wow, those Americans know what they're doing. I'll buy American products. You know, America is really on top of the ball game. I'll buy American products. I trust Americans. And to some extent, we've dropped the ball here. And I have a feeling that when all the dust settles, we are going to take a little hit to our prestige, which is going to hurt American manufacturers. Because we had an advantage that, say, the Koreans or the Germans or the Israelis didn't have, where we could just walk in and say, hey, trust us. We're an American company with big market share in America. We have a good product. I have a feeling we're going to take a little hit and we're going to have to work harder next year to regain some of that trust.
Right. So let me dovetail off that point. That's well stated. So how do you see the dynamic between the U.S. and China changing post COVID-19?
Well, China took a big hit too, right? I mean, China's lost a lot of their manufacturing capacity and a lot of their magic, right? People have been thinking, oh, well, you know, if I need something, I can buy it in China. I think a lot of that manufacturing is going to reshore. It's going to come back to America. It's going to shift to other places. China, I think, is going to take a huge hit from this. And if they take a huge hit from this, they're not going to have as much money to buy American products or German products or Arab fuel, right? So I think they're going to, when we were kids, I'm thinking you're maybe a little bit younger than I am, but it used to be Japanese products weren't considered that great. And then Japan became the real fantastic country for manufacturing. And then they're not that great anymore. And China is the big country. So I think China is on a downward swing after COVID. I don't think they're going to gain position. So that dynamic between the United States and China, I think both of us took a big hit. And what we're probably going to see is more smaller countries taking stronger positions, or maybe more of a sharing of it. There won't be one or two major countries. I honestly, I'm not going to do a solid prediction here, but if I had to bet, I'd say it's not going to be, America, China, and two or three others, and then everybody else way below. I think there's going to be a sharing out, and some of the smaller countries are going to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying, because there's been a lot of discussion on the supply chain and the need to bring critical industries back to the U.S. I read, in fact, today an article where China supplies 97% of the pharmaceuticals supplied to the United States, and that's just one example. So what guidance can you provide to U.S. businesses trying to navigate this dynamic time? Because I'm thinking, I'm a startup or I'm a mid-cap company and I want to do my international business and start to grow. With the thrust of maybe bringing some of this all back to the States, how does that disrupt that international sales dynamic?
Well, you know what? Let's put those two things aside, because I think, aside from the fact that if we bring more things back to the U.S., there might be less money available for people to buy American goods. That might impact us. But let's talk for a second about what should American companies be doing. Well, we're going to be facing part of any sale, part of any business is developing trust. And if you're a smaller or a mid-sized manufacturer and you are either starting or expanding your international sales now, you're going to face a rougher path, because people aren't going to, welcome you and trust you as much as they might have 6 months ago or a year ago, based on the fact of your track record in the United States. So I think, what I tell people, and this might sound a little self-serving, but I think a lot of these manufacturers that are trying to expand internationally try to do it without getting either a local person to help them or somebody with experience in international sales. And I think understanding how to drive and build trust internationally from a cultural perspective is going to be key in the next 2 years. And finding somebody who can help you with that is really going to be key, because there are ways to, in the same way that South Korea, if you remember 15, 20 years ago, nobody was going to buy a South Korean car. And now they're one of the biggest manufacturers that sells to the United States. They established trust. They built it up. There are ways that you can build up trust with somebody that isn't quite sure that they can trust you. You just have to know how to do it. And, popping in without really understanding those cultural issues is not going to serve people well, I think, especially right now.
So let me shift gears a little bit. We have, a lot of trade deals that President Trump came into office really targeting and focused on.
Right.
With the Defense Protection Act, President Trump now has a tool, I'd argue, to bring these industries back to the United States under the guise of, we need critical national security production here in the U.S. So given the recent passes of USMCA, this alliance with the North American Alliance, in my opinion, is really designed to counter China and their influence. But having said all that, what impact do you see these trade deals having on international sales and strategy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of the problems, and I don't typically like to talk politics in these type of things, but one of the problems I see with a lot of these treaties is we had treaties in place that everybody assumed were going to last longer, and then we changed them. And like I said, with a lot of business, trust is key. So I would think that a lot of people now are saying, well, we had a treaty. They canceled that treaty to push a new treaty through. How long is that treaty going to be good? And we've already seen a lot of countries that were doing business with the United States decide that they should find it. In the same way we're saying, well, can we trust China? Should we look for alternative sources? So China is now buying a lot more from Argentina and Brazil than the stuff that they used to buy from us. And we see that with other places. So I think one of the things we're going to see from these things that have happened over the past 2 or 3 years is a little bit of chaos in terms of who trusts who worldwide. Everybody's thinking, we had these systems in place for years. Now they're not in place. How long can we trust the new system? So these things, I think there's a big chaos in the trust issue of international sales right now, which is going to be difficult for everybody to overcome, Americans and everybody else, I think. And that's going to be a big thing that people are going to have to work on.
Right. So what do you think the biggest challenge is for a startup? And I'm running a startup. For a startup setting up its footprint internationally, what is the biggest challenge that a CEO is sort of confronting?
I hate to say it this way, but probably pride. If you are the CEO of a startup, let's say you're a CEO of a manufacturing startup, and your background is in finance, or your background is in research and development or something like that, you say, well, I should probably hire a professional to manage my manufacturing. I should probably hire a professional to handle my finances. I should probably hire a professional for this. And then you say, but international sales, I spent my honeymoon in Paris. I'll do this myself, right? And what very often happens is people jump into stuff that they don't really understand. And it is a very, very expensive mistake. And I see this all the time. Like I'd say I've made my living fixing these mistakes that people have made over the years, because what'll happen, let's say you make a widget, you're a small $5 million or $10 million manufacturing company in the Midwest, you make an excellent widget, and you decide you want to try selling it in France, Italy, and Japan. And the chances of those being the right markets for you is extremely slim. Right. But I'll tell you what, 9 times out of 10, when I talk to people, the first countries they're going into happen to be fun countries to take vacations to, coincidentally, right?
Interesting.
So what happens is people don't sit down and say, okay, let me figure out what the best market to get into is. Let me figure out how do I figure out who the right partnership is? How do I set up the sales channel? People, very often when dealing with international business, they shoot from the hip. They work with their emotions. And then they end up really paying for it years later. It's very difficult and very expensive to fix. And that's what I'd say. And it sounds a little funny, but the bottom line is this really does happen. I see this all the time. I worked with a company once, and they spent millions of dollars trying to get into Australia, which they turned into tens of thousands of dollars of sales. And when I started to look into the whole thing, the previous vice president of international sales' wife had this real dream that she wanted to live in Australia for 6 months. So there was this whole, when you looked back at it, it was a clear-cut path. They established, a business in Australia. He went to run the business for 6 months, blah, blah, blah. They spent a lot of money, didn't make a penny out of it. And it was all about keeping his wife happy. And you see this all the time. It sounds funny, but this is the type of thing you see with international sales quite often.
That's interesting.
When you approach it when you approach it in the same method, if you were to say, I make a widget, how can I find the very best alloy to manufacture this widget from? You do a little bit of research, you try a few different things, etc. And when you look at sales that way, if you say, okay, I really need to generate as much revenue as possible, how do I figure out what the right market is for me? How do I figure out who the right customer is? How do I figure out the right marketing package? If you think through it like you're an engineer, you're going to be a lot more successful than if you think through it like you're a tourist.
And emotionally. And that's a really interesting story
Right.
about life and the desire to placate the wife in terms of trying to grow a business. So what are some practical steps a startup or maybe a mid-cap company can take to enter these international markets?
Well, I would say the very first thing is to figure out why exactly do people buy your product? And that sounds like a silly question, but if you understand why, you can figure out where there are people like that. So for instance, I don't know, let's say you make brake pads and typically you're selling them to car manufacturers. So where are you going to sell your products? You're going to sell in countries that have a lot of car manufacture, right? If you sell I've sold a couple of different products that were sold to what I'd call growing middle class, people whose parents were working class and now they're middle class. So you can demographically, and you can see where there are countries that have growing middle class, and you can follow those numbers, and then you can choose if that's a great market. So that would be the very first step, is trying to figure out why people buy your product, when they buy it, and then identify where you can find people like that. Then I would say you figure out your sales organization. Are you going to use partners, channel partners, which is typically the best way for a small or mid-sized company to go. And again, you don't want to do this emotionally. You don't want to say, well, this friend of mine who was in college with me, I think he'd be a great sales manager. You want to find somebody with experience, or you want to find the right channel partners in the country that sell to the targeted customers right now, that kind of thing. So those are the type of things I'd say the very first steps are to figure out where you should be selling and how you should be addressing those customers. And really, if you can do those two things well in the beginning, you're going to be successful. You're going to see revenue out of this. But if you screw those up, you're going to be crying about it 5 years from now.
Right. And then try and do that song and dance with the board of directors. So what is the biggest challenge in working with and through channel partners / international distributors as you're entering these markets?
Well, I don't know if you ever heard this, but they used to say that Ginger Rogers could do everything that Fred Astaire did, but she had to do it backwards and in heels, right? So when you're dealing with channel sales, you're doing everything that direct sales does, but you're doing it with severe limitations. You have less information, you have less control over the market, you can't fire salespeople, you can't bribe salespeople, et cetera, right? So everything is a little bit more difficult. People very often don't get that. They don't think of channel sales as being the more difficult side. They think of it as more like marketing. So you have to be very careful about selecting the right partners. And I go through a very rigorous selection process. Sometimes I'll interview 15 to 25 different partners in a market before I choose one. You have to be careful on how you train them and work with them, because they're independent businesses. If you push them too much, they can quit. If you don't push them enough, they won't bring you in revenue, right? They sell other things. Sometimes you say, oh, I want the biggest distributor in Saudi Arabia, but he sells 1,000 other products. So he's only going to give you a very small amount of focus. Or you take somebody that sells no other product and he can't afford to attend a trade show because he doesn't have enough money. So you have to balance all of those things and find really the very right fit for you. And those are the real challenges with setting up an international distribution network. But getting it right is how you multiply force, because you can have 200, in a year, you can have 200 salespeople selling your product around the world, and you're not paying anybody's salary, right? So that's something, as a $100 million manufacturer in the United States, there's no way you can get that kind of coverage without using a good channel sales organization.
Right, absolutely. So when selling products domestically, the terms are pretty simple, right? So when you sell the same products internationally, the terminology and who pays for it can mean the difference between having a profitable and a non-profitable sale. So what advice can you offer to ensure that these sales internationally are profitable?
Again, I would say this is going to sound, this is going to sound like I'm an a-hole sometimes, but it's all about pride. Every company I've ever worked with, the first thing I did was I went to the shipping manager and I said, I highly recommend that you read a few books on international shipping and attend a workshop on this. And virtually every time they say to me, Zach, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what I'm doing. And I say, when we scale up international shipments, this is going to totally overwhelm you. There's a lot of stuff you should learn before things get too crazy. And they say, no, no, don't worry about it. And then 2 years later, they start making big mistakes that cost a lot of money. So the thing is, there's information out there. You can buy a book on international shipping terms. You can sit down in 2 hours and you can learn everything in that book. And that will teach you everything you need to know. You can attend workshops that take 3 hours online and cost you $50, and they'll teach you everything you need to know. You just have to be willing to do that. You have to be able to say, you know, this is something I don't know, and I should really study this.
No, that's great advice. I think that's really misunderstood. I think sometimes internationally, you know somebody in France, they're a good friend of you, or somebody knows somebody, and you just pick that person because it's the path of least resistance.
Right.
It feels like a good fit, but oftentimes comes back to bite you. So what is the best way to decide which international market is best for your business? I saw a lot of your posts, and you're literally all over the world. Is it, you know, what's it like going into Britain or Australia, or is it the right market for you? So, you know, depending on obviously the widget, I'm in medical devices. How do you determine which international markets are really the most appropriate?
Well, and I'll let's use as an example healthcare, because that's sort of an easy thing to say. So you can basically say, well, do I sell a product that is sold to richer people or to poorer people? Am I solving a problem that poor countries have, or am I solving a problem that rich countries have? Am I selling a product that's going to be bought by middle-aged men, or am I selling a product that's mostly going to be bought by teenage girls? And if I take a look at that, I can basically then look at markets and I can say, well, if what I'm selling is something that is really targeted, let's say at women who are entering childbearing years, right? I can figure out where those markets are. If I'm selling something that's sold to affluent 50-year-old men with college degrees, I can figure out where those people are. And again, this is a type of thing. People, very often I say this to people and they're like, oh my God, this is so much research. You can sit down, or the right person can sit down in 2 hours and research online, right? And that's really not difficult. So doing this research, figuring it out, and typically figuring it out by who your customer is and where you can find those customers, that's always going to be the best way to start.
No, I agree. And so pre-COVID-19, one would argue the U.S. economy was on an upward trend. And as you looked around globally, there's probably a number of economies you've identified that were also on an upward trend. And you also mentioned that as we move forward, manufacturing base will change and shift, and there's certainly some headwinds. But as you look forward post-COVID-19, which economies around the world would you recommend to keep an eye on?
I would say Sub-Saharan Africa. Look, the countries that are off our radar today and are poor countries, I would correlate those with good education and look at those. So you take a look at Sub-Saharan Africa, every country there essentially is poor, but they're growing 4 or 5 times as quickly as any country in Europe or the United States. So sure, they're poor today. Are they going to be poor in 15 years? Rwanda is manufacturing cars. They're manufacturing small electronics. We might not want to buy a car from Rwanda today, but in 7 or 8 years, they might be selling most of the cars in Africa, right? So those are the type of markets I would keep my eye on. And the same type of thing you have in South Asia. You know, I talked about Bangladesh to somebody a couple of days ago, and I said, you know, there are 200 million people in Bangladesh, and he was just shocked. And I said, you know, if you consider how many people there are educated, that's a growing market. Now it's a poor country, but in 10, 15 years, it might not be that poor, right? So those are the type of markets I keep an eye on.
Great. What is the most influential international business book you've read and would recommend?
Ooh. So I'm going to say this. I haven't read a book about international business that I would really recommend. I'm in the process of publishing one, and I would say that's probably going to be the best book that you could read on the subject, but it isn't available now. But I would say that having a good understanding of sales, and there are, 4 or 5 tremendous sales books out there that are really good today. There's also a book specifically about cultural differences, whose name I can't remember. The author's first name is Aaron, and that's a fantastic book to understand the differences between cultures. So I can't tell you one book that I would say that's a great one, but I'd say if you want to do business internationally, you have to know how to sell, you have to know how to understand culture, and if you wait 3 months, buy my book.
What's the name of your book when it comes out?
It's Going Global, and it's a guide to being a global sales manager. So
And will this be available on Amazon?
it will be available on Amazon.
And then you're going to have it you said about 4 months?
Yeah, it's in the publishing process right now.
Oh, great. Going global. We'll look for it for sure. So switching gears a little bit, who's been the most influential person in your life?
That's I've been interviewed a bunch of times. Nobody's ever asked me that. I would go with the stereotype of, I would say, my parents. And my dad was not very successful at things. And he was a nice guy, but not very successful at things. And I spent most of my life saying, well, what would my dad do? I should probably do the opposite. But my dad walked out on me when I was 15 and I had to make a living. So that was an extremely influential trigger, because I had to work hard my whole life.
Yeah.
So that's probably what I'd say. To answer your question specifically, that's the most influential person on my life.
That's interesting. It's kind of interesting influence, because it's not, it is positive, because you can look at it like, I learned from what I didn't want to become. And then that 15-year-old boy and that epic experience really brought you into the man you are today. So there's a lot of positive in that, but it's sort of a negative. But that's one of the most interesting responses I've heard in my show yet.
Yeah, and you know what? I ended up I had a very good relationship with my dad in the last few years of his life. I could have been bitter about the whole thing, and I wasn't. In the end, all these little things make you into the person you are. So
exactly. What is one of the most important lessons you've learned in life?
So I'll go back to being a kid. I was a pain in the ass as a boy. And when I was probably 7 or 8, I was a know-it-all type of kid. And I remember having an argument with another boy, and my mother came over and she said, just let him win once. Let him win. You don't have to be right all the time. And I'll remember that my whole life, because I'll tell you what, one of the, how many times today have I mentioned the concept of pride, right? I think pride is the enemy of business, because when you're dealing with salespeople, when you're dealing with customers, when you're dealing in business, you can be right or you can close purchase orders, right? You can't go in and say to a customer, hey, I know everything about you, blah, 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 give me a purchase order. You got to be willing to let the other guy be right. Mm-hmm. So that was probably the most influential thing. And I was probably 7 or 8 at the time. So 45 years, I've been earning money off of that little lesson.
That's fantastic. That's great advice as well. Is there anything we've not covered that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think in this time of COVID, we're all really struggling, and I have a feeling that in the end, it's going to be okay. And we should all keep in mind, we're all in, and I typically don't say anything quite so flowery at the end of these things, but you know what? We're all in this together. There's no sense of being mean to people about this. We're all going to get out of it. It's going to cost us all a chunk of our savings. It's going to be painful. But if we can get out of this alive, with our loved ones alive, and we have a job when it's over, we're ahead. So we should try and be nice to each other.
That's great perspective, Zach. So where can they learn more about you or get connected to you?
Great. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn under Zack Selch. I have a YouTube channel called YouTube /C/Zack Selch. And I have a website called Global Sales Mentor. And that tells a lot about the services I provide. And just to give you a little perspective of what I try to do, I try to avoid being in the business of giving people fish. I want to teach them how to fish. So my whole idea is if you are a small manufacturer or a mid-sized manufacturer, you just got global sales responsibility, I coach and I train and I support to put you in a position so you can grow your international sales dramatically. As opposed to you coming to me and saying, hey, Zach, can you set me up an international distribution network? I'll do that too, but I'd rather teach you so that, you know, you pay me once and then you're self-sufficient and you can keep growing. So,
yeah, I was going to say you have a very specialized business model, because I know I've approached the international market several times in my career to go, you know, set up international distribution, and rarely did I come across somebody with the roadmap, the experience, the lookouts, the gotchas, et cetera. So that's a very specialized service, and certainly something that'll be in demand as we exit COVID.
I believe so. And the return on investment is huge, because if I can cut your learning curve down by 2 years, I'm putting, you know, tens of millions of dollars in your pocket. And that's the basic idea. And I've grown things. Yeah, I'm not in the 10% growth business. I'm in the 1,000% to 4,000% business. So if I can come in and help you go from, you know, selling $100 million domestically and $1 million internationally to 100 domestically and 25 internationally, and I can do that in 2 or 3 years by coaching and supporting you, that's a pretty good return on investment for you.
Yeah, you're in the exponential growth business.
You know, that's the thing, because what I find is usually there are just so many little things to fix that are pretty obvious that, and once you fix those, the growth just shoots through the roof, right? And very often when I talk to people, they're like, give me a realistic growth number. I said, this is realistic. I'm telling you, in 3 years, this is where you're going to be if you follow my instructions. And sure enough, we hit it and people are happy.
Fantastic. Hey, Zach, thanks so much for coming on Beyond. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks a lot, Ben. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
Keep there.
Take care, man.